In section 2, we'll talk about why it's so hard to do. And then section 3, the interesting thing is, how does God do it? What can we apply from that? And then how can we apply that? Taking God's God. We can't do everything that he can do, obviously, so there's going to be limits on our ability to apply interactive storytelling, but what can we apply that's actually useful and could make games more interesting? So, part 1 is what is interactive storytelling? If most of you haven't been dealing with interactive storytelling, I suppose you wouldn't know who Chris Crawford is, but Chris Crawford has kind of what's considered in the computer world the important book he released this last year on interactive storytelling. And in that book, Chris Crawford defines interactive storytelling as, actually, he doesn't define it. He completely skirts the subject of trying to give a definition, which is kind of interesting. The main book on interactive storytelling refuses to define what it is, although he spends a lot of time talking about people that think they know what it is and trying to tell them what it isn't. So I had to go through and dig up from lots of other sources. I've been reading other sources on interactive storytelling and try and get a sense of what it is. So these are the parts first. We start with the 2 parts, but it's bigger than the sum of the parts. So interaction, and this is Chris Crawford's definition basically, is 2 or more parties engaged in meaningful communication with each other. So interactivity is more than just one person talking and the other person listening. It's one person talking, the other person listening, thinking about it, and then responding. It's also more than just 2 people jabbering at each other. It's actually dealing with a recognition, a response, and then a result that comes back out of it. Now, communication is thought of as very broad. You could think of sports as interactivity, obviously. You don't have to talk in sports, but you're usually passing data. A ball is going flying one direction, a move is being made, something is happening that the other person has to process, come up with a response to, and respond. Yes?
Is an example of interactive storytelling paper pencil RPG?
We'll get to that. We're not going to cut to the chase yet. We'll get through this. And it really depends on how you define it. That's what we'll get to as well. I have nearly 40 slides and we have 80 minutes, so I'm going to be trying to move. This will be a little bit slower, but we'll pick up speed as we go along. Storytelling is also incredibly hard to define. So for the case of argument here, what we're trying to deal with is meaningful information that's transferred between one person and another. So the art of portraying what happened in real or imagined events in a way that elicits emotional connection. So simply sitting down and giving a documentary of something that occurred, or one person jumbling words together in grammatically correct sentences, is not storytelling. Storytelling is dealing where you're actually trying to pass information. So we're going to take the highfalutin concept of storytelling here, that we're talking about things that mean things to people, that represent something that you can emotionally connect with. And emotional is being very, very broad there, so it doesn't have to be tragic. It can be happy, it can be simply information, but it's a way that you actually connect with it because it means something to you. So interactive storytelling is not just interactivity coupled with storytelling. It is more than that. It is the interactivity of storytelling itself, taking the story and allowing the people to collaborate on creating their story. So let's get some examples of storytelling and interactivity and kind of think about what's in between them. Plays and sports, movies versus games. So movies is the epitome of story, or one of the epitomes of storytelling. It's controlled by the author. Games, on the other hand, very, very interactive. 2 things that we engage in. Speeches and debates, dictatorship and democracy, plot and choice. Actually, I realized afterwards I should change that. It's not really democracy. Interactivity would be anarchy. You've got full choice, maybe. Well, I guess democracy is sort of interactive too, so you can kind of cover that a couple ways. Plot versus choice. Linearity versus branching. That's one of the important things. If your story is linear, no matter how the player interacts, then it's not interactive storytelling. Branching. Consistency versus freedom. Determinism versus volition. So what does it mean? A lot of things to a lot of people, and this is part of the reason why there's so much talk about it and so little agreement on what it is. People come at it from several different directions. Well, for those of you who are visually oriented, the next slide will be the visual for this. I'll try and answer questions at the end, because otherwise I'm not going to get through it too well, unless I obviously am stepping on my toes on something that can point it out. So progression from storytelling. Obviously, storytelling was older than computers or any of the rest of the stuff that's going on. Storytelling's been around for a long time, and people have attempted to make it interactive for a long time. Some of the early attempts were in plays and things like that, where they allowed the audience to interact with the people or try and change the course of the play to some extent. It's a kind of interesting concept, getting involved. And so people have taken the idea of having a story and then trying to put some amount of audience participation in with it. And so it's progression from a pure story towards more interactivity. So that's one direction some people come at it. People we mostly deal with are coming with progression from games. The concept that you have a game, but it doesn't have a story in it, or you've layered a story, but you want to have the player to actually have some impact on the story, not just be involved in a world that has a story going on independent of them. And then a lot of times, for some crazy reason, people refer to it as a concept of the goal of interactive storytelling is to let the player do whatever they want. It's a form of ultimate make-believe. You can do whatever you want to do, and you can write your own story and do your own thing. So that's where people kind of come at it from, I would say 3 different directions. What's not quite it? So following these things. Stories interplace with gameplay. So if you've got a period of story, you guys remember Dragon Slayer? A little bit of story, a little bit of activity. A little bit of story, a little bit of interactivity. You make the right choice, the story goes on. You make the wrong choice, you meet Davy Jones. You know, that's how the story goes. It's not really, it's linear, really. You'd think it's branching, but every wrong branch ends the story. The right branch continues it. So it's a step, but it's not the solution that I see. And most interactive storytelling people would say that's not it. Games that have stories in them. You're playing a game, but there's a story going on around in the world that's independent of you. Great drama, good idea, but it's not interactive. And then a pure make-believe system. Once again, interactivity represents the collaboration, not the absence of the author. So a pure make-believe system is you doing it all. It's not you interacting on the story. Visual people. This took me a long time to do, and I'm surprised. I looked at lots of interactive storytelling. For some reason, everybody who writes about interactive storytelling is auditory learners, I guess. I'm visual, and I haven't seen anybody visualize it, and I'm pretty proud of this. Anyway, interactivity. More player control, more author control. In the middle, we have interactivity. Now, stories are here. They've got dramatic content, they have emotional connection. You can have a lot of different kinds of stories. And this isn't a perfect diagram because there's like lots of dimensions that we could cut this into. But in a fairly real sense, storytelling is about drama. It's about giving people an emotional connection that means something to them. Action movies, Michael Bay, pretty low on that end. It's about blowing things up and running around in cool special effects.
Right.
Yeah. Anyway, now and then they try to put a little story in there, but you can tell they don't know what they're doing. Anyway, so games, on the other hand, they take place in that blowing up and cool special effects world generally. And they are generally highly interactive. So games are the epitome of interactivity. Movies are but lack of story. Movies, books generally have a lot of story, but very little activity. And this, to me, represents the 2 different directions that you find with the schools of thought. There's a lot of academic talk on interactive storytelling. And the problem is you've got some groups coming in from this direction. They've been doing movies, they've been into the drama stuff, and they're trying to add interactivity. Then you've got people down here that have been doing interactivity all their lives, but they're trying to add drama. And they're moving in from this side. And then you've got some people that are wacky out here, you know, trying to move in from this side. Obviously, true player control of the story is called Microsoft Word. That's where you can sit down, you write your own story. It's, you know, no rule system, you can do it however you want to. So, interactivity is where we're trying to get to, and interactivity with meaning is where we're trying to get to. Something that actually has a dramatic connection to the player, and the player is involved in that drama as opposed to just simply watching it progress. Why interactive storytelling? That little bubble that we saw up there, it's really, really hard to get to. Not many people are there. And in the academic realm, that generally is enough of a reason to try and do something. And so a lot of the academics say this is the next big thing. And they say it's the next big thing because nobody's doing it. To me, that doesn't work out as a complete solution. But it is really interesting, and as we look at it more, there's more reason to it. Additionally, a few people have tried to add out there the kind of concept that, you know, with the problems that we're having with games today, they don't have an emotional connection, there's no realistic consequences for the actions you take, et cetera, that interactive storytelling is the way to actually, you know, make it a little bit more like real life, make it a little bit more where the drama is responding to the actions that you take. But really, to me, the place where it has benefit, or where it has interesting output, is when we start comparing the goals of why people enjoy stories and why people enjoy games. And they're sort of contradictory, but they have some amount of overlap. So we play games, games are generally an emotional high from accomplishing something challenging, whereas storytelling is an emotional high from connecting with the characters in the story. Generally, games are more interested in the goal at the end. And that's where you're trying to get to, and your goal is accomplished, or your excitement is accomplishing that goal. You're thinking.
Final Fantasy, a combination of the two?
Probably. I mean, now you still have to wonder about the interactivity at that point, but that's,
Okay.
but anyway, yeah, we'll get through a bunch of these things. Storytelling is the emotional high from connecting with the characters of the story. So it's the progression of the story as you're moving through the story. And so if you can create something where you have an emotional high from actually interacting with the characters, not just the progression, but rather actually accomplishing something in other people's lives, kind of like what we have in real life. When you see somebody get saved, that's really, really exciting. That's something where, and especially if you're involved in it, where you see that you had some impact in somebody's life. And if you can create that same sort of excitement, maybe with raising children or things like that, that emotional high from seeing what you're doing have an impact on other people or on society, it's kind of exciting. And additionally, when you're able to interact with the people in there and complete something together as a task, it can be even more exciting. Should put a little aside here. Multiplayer games obviously do a lot of this internally, and it happens because you're dealing with real people in the game. I'm not going to talk too much about multiplayer games in here, but maybe we can talk about them at the end. It's kind of a whole different animal. Because you are dealing with people, they can generate responses that it's incredibly difficult to make a computer respond like. So, I am going to go back one slide because I think there's something interesting on this one also. I meant to mention this. Dramatic stories, the things that you get out of them and learn from them, they have good and bad to them. And that's one of the things I think is interesting here, dealing with what the good and the bad results are with each of these. When you interact with people, when you learn to interact with people, or when you see people interacting together, you learn things like caring for others. You learn things like self-sacrifice. You can connect with that. Additionally, though, you have the risk of, lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes. When you're dealing with hero stories or action stories, the concept behind them is accomplishment, human accomplishment, self-accomplishment. That's why I have internal versus external. This is the things that I'm accomplishing, the things that I'm doing with other people, external to me. These are the things that I see myself doing. And down here, you have things like diligence, self-control, using your skills. These are things that are really important in games generally. On the other hand, obviously, you have the pride of life. You have getting caught up in yourself and crushing those annoying little guys and blowing them to bits. Okay, so if it's so cool, what's the problem? So a lot of people have tried it. A lot of people are interested in it. Nobody's actually done anything that's really terribly interesting. Well, they've done stuff that's interesting, that's meeting the criteria, really. So 3 main things I'm going to get at here. 1, creating a system to generate stories representing realistic events and realistic interactions, that's interpersonal reactions, is incredibly difficult. You start dealing with what it really takes to make it something look like a real person, act like a real person, much less act like society, much less try and accept input on that decision process, and then make all of that actually have some sort of dramatic output and not be just utter chaos. Crazy, crazy stuff. Additionally, this is one of the things that I put in for Chris Crawford's sake, takes a different mindset. Both groups are coming at it from 2 different directions. Both of them have to throw out a lot of baggage. The game players, the game developers, as well as the story writers, to make it to that middle point where it actually gels as its own little monster. And then the interesting thing, many of the elements that you deal with when trying to create this synthesis group of interactivity and storytelling are contradictory, flat out. In fact, they're so contradictory that there's many people in the school of thought of interactive storytelling whose conclusion is there's no way to do it. Can't be done. Cannot make something that's both interactive and allows the player to allows the author to still define a cohesive story. So, first problem, we'll deal with this one first. I'm not going to read through all this. This is just a whole ton of stuff off of kind of the things that Chris Crawford had put together, as well as things that I thought of, and what it takes to actually make a story interactive to the point where story interactive to the point where it feels like reality, feels realistic.
Seems
So-
kind of what the holodeck was trying to do.
That's even a more immersive one.
Actually, Ender's Game, the interactive computer in that one. Orson Scott Card. No, it's a
There's a
book.
book. Okay. Anyway, simply by skimming over this list, you can see that interactive storytelling requires social and psychological analysis of humanity that people today haven't even figured out, much less trying to figure out how to program. We are very much so fearfully and wonderfully made, and all of his ways are beyond finding out. And I think all we're ever going to do, at best, is make rough estimations, attempting to vaguely emulate what God does seamlessly and without many people even noticing it. So, making something act real is incredibly tough. Now, if you can do all this stuff, you can get kind of close. It's still not going to be, good enough for Turing, perhaps, but it's going to be pretty good. But it's going to be really, really difficult to get there. And this is a lot of what Chris Crawford and the other people that are actually trying to do something are trying to move through each of these points and figure out how to actually make them work. Although, for all their stuff about all this stuff up here, this point, I haven't seen anybody come up with real solutions on creating something that connects with emotion. Alrighty. Chris Crawford points, thinking outside the game box. So he's talking about it mostly towards the game developers, and he's saying, here's what you gotta do to move away from your concepts about games, what you gotta throw out about how you try and build games, and how to get there. So, point number one, the story must define the game, not the game the story. For those of you guys that were in Scott Wong's talk earlier, that's a point that he made as well, I think is really good. You start with the story, you start with the concepts you're trying to get across, you start with the meaning, and then you define the game around it, not vice versa. It's not gonna work. Interactive storytelling is just flat out not gonna work if you start with the gameplay. One of his points, and if you're getting at all into interactive storytelling, you'll hear about this a lot, verbs are more important than nouns. When you play a computer game, pick an average first-person shooter, how many objects do you get to interact with? Lots, hundreds usually. How many things can you do with those objects?
4, 5, 6.
Yeah, 4 or 5 things. Him, you want multiples of actions over objects. You want to be able to do lots of things. If you're going to interact like a real person, we do a lot more. There's lots of objects around us, but really when you think about it, everything that choices you make are about the doing. And yeah, did you mention that? Yeah. So that's the concept. Whenever you choose, I thought that was a really good point you made. Whenever you choose something, you're choosing an action. You don't ever really choose an object. You choose an apple or you choose a pear, you're choosing to eat an apple or choosing to eat a pear. You're choosing to pick it up, you're choosing to do something with it. Your choice is based on what things you can do with it, not on the object itself generally. So the decision presented to the players, this is another one that's really cool and something to really think about. We'll get to it at the end. But decisions presented to the players need to be staged so that they are meaningful decisions. He gives us a picture of a standard storyline. If you're going to write a normal storyline and you start going through the major decisions, go through Star Wars. Okay, so you're Luke Skywalker, the very first one, and you're, or third, fourth one, whatever it is now. And you're sitting out on your lonely little planet, and suddenly you have a chance to go rescue the princess. Your choices are rescue the princess or sit on your lonely planet. What kind of choice is that? I mean, that's not interactive, really. It is interactive, but boy. And then, okay, you can choose to go with this, or, most of the choices are pretty obvious which way to go. If you're going to make something that's interactive that you want to be interesting to the player, the choices they have to make have to be the ones that are interesting, not the ones that are the major plot twists. Or you have to make all your plot twists, you have to think about your story differently and how you can make those choices actually have meaning in them and be interesting. Either they've got to pay attention to clues if it's a thinking problem, or they've got to pay attention to emotion if it's a decision about a personal decision, but it's got to mean something to them. It's not stay on your planet or go rescue the princess. Okay, energy must be put into the story world as opposed to the storyline. You put as many objects and actions out there, so actions are part of the story world. I'm not talking about just objects here, I'm talking about the environment, so that they've got all the choices, and then the storyline, it may not be that long. You've got lots of stuff you can do, though, to get there. You have alternate ways of getting through it. This is a point we talked about a lot. Stories have meaning for people. Some of the things that also he puts in there, not too important, but he says, permit unreasonable choices and then let the consequences be played out. So usually in games, you ride out, you do the wrong thing, your character dies, end of game, start over again, go on. He's saying, let the consequences play out. Don't just stop the player when they get to when they go try and do something stupid. So if they go to jump over the rail, you let them jump over the rail, you let them die, you don't put a wall in front of the rail that says, oh, you can't go that direction. And then use environmental manipulation to heighten the drama and not foil the player. Same kind of concept. don't block people off saying you can't go through that door until you solve this puzzle, and then you can continue the story. The story should have an option for you to go out there and run into whatever the bad thing is before you've gone and picked up the axe out of the other room or whatever it is. Alrighty. And let's see, so here's a comparison between stories and games. So once again, thinking differently. What we're dealing with, we're trying to find something that's in the middle here. And probably it's going to be a little bit more towards this side. But this is a comparison of what games do and what storytelling does. Stories have meaning. Games have a goal. Same kind of concept. Are you trying to present meaning, or are you trying to let them accomplish a goal? Stories have plots. Plot is what drives it. Games, it's about the rules and the goal. You got a set of rules, you got a goal to make it to, you make it through the rules, and you make it there at the end. Stories are about people, games are about the player. Stories is progress driven. So stories, remember, progress is driven by the author. So if you're watching a movie, the author decides how the movie progresses. If you're playing a game, generally you're the one that decides whether the game keeps moving or stops. Now, yeah, you can have games that have timers in them, but still the game stops. If you choose to stop, you'll die sooner or later, or whatever will happen. Stories exemplify the social consequences of actions. Almost every story is about somebody or something that happens that has a social consequence. And by social, it doesn't have to be lots of people, it could be just one person, but has an impact on their life. Games, on the other hand, usually try very hard to avoid the social consequences of actions. You just pretend like it doesn't matter that you killed 3 dozen people, because they were all bad anyway. But the quintessential problem, which is one I put on there last, is the contradiction between the terms themselves, interactive and storytelling, and the concepts that they provide. Interactive means the player gets to influence what things happen. Storytelling means the author has something to tell and thus needs to decide what happens. And this is where a lot of people get hung up. This is the big problem. This is why some of the academics say there is no, the group space for interactive and the group space for storytelling don't have an overlap. There's no way to get in between there and let the player make decisions about what happens in the story and yet still give something meaningful and create a meaningful drama. So, how do you create a meaningful story arc when you have some annoying player running around messing things up? Which leads us to part 3, learning from the Master Storyteller, which, for those of you questioning, is not me, but rather all of creation is a story. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. God decides the story, the big stories in our life. Creation starts with God said, and wraps up with God saying, it is done. So, God is speaking our story. And Christ, obviously, is the author and finish of our faith. Again, another story done by God. God is the master storyteller, and creation is the story, and we are the players. But creation is interactive. Choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And creativity, the first duty performed by man, was naming the animals. God says he wanted to see what Adam would name each of the animals, and he lined them up in front of him and had him name them each. I mean, God appreciates man being creative. God lets man be creative. We're told to work out our own salvation with fear and trembling. God expects us to interact with his creation and to seek out his will. So, you remember those annoying players running around messing things up? That's us. God has mastered the technique of allowing us to interact with his creation, but still maintains the story he means to tell. So it can be done. It can be done by somebody much, much greater than us, but it can be done. There is an overlap in that arc. And the best place to learn it is from him. So I drew that picture, the diagram kind of before. Here's the author, here's us. Interactive storytelling, there's that bubble right down there. That's where we are now. God's got some control, he's given us some control. And despite all that, God still has a story that he wants to tell, and he's going to tell it despite us. So, how does God pull it off? Hey, here's a fun little drawing. This is where we're getting into new and interesting stuff. been having a lot of fun because I was frustrated with all the interactive storytelling people saying all these different things, and I thought, let's go back to Scripture and try and work this out. So I'm giving you the answer. We'll go through examples. I'm not saying this is the final answer. There's probably lots of other things to think about, but this is a visual way, at least, of applying what seems to be pretty clear in Scripture, the way God does things. So he structures his story with what I'm calling micro-stories. These are the little plot points in our life. Let's see. I'll go with both. Micro-stories that lead up to story gates. And in the Bible, usually the story gates that we know the most about are the ones that are prophecies, where he says, this is what I will do. And when it happens, he does it. So, story gates are the points of convergence. Do you read Chris Crawford? Or have you gone through that, Jerry? Have you read Chris Crawford, or did you?
I was working something similar to this, but not as
Okay.
far. This is interesting.
So, Chris Crawford talks about points of convergence. When you got a whole bunch of choices, one of the solutions he says doesn't work is the fact when you got a whole bunch of choices and then at some point you start cutting off the player's choices and you converge them back to a single point where then you move the story on. Because if you give players lots and lots of choices, you start, even if you give them 2 choices at every point they break up, you guys know the math, it gets really, really big, really, really quick. And then you suddenly got all these things you have to keep track of. So a way to get around that is to converge the story back together and then pull it out and converge it back together. So you're hunting through a cave system and pretty soon you get far enough in the cave system, all the paths lead back to the big dragon that you got to slay at the end. You converge it, even though it looked like you had lots of choices, somewhere along there you get back to one point at the end. So these are points of convergence, but they're not regular points of convergence because God makes them fairly non-specific. He leaves them vague enough that he has multiple ways of fulfilling them and multiple ways of getting through them. So he can set a certain amount of variation and still fulfill his purpose. I'm not going to read it at the moment, but Isaiah 48:5 and 48:6 is kind of a cool set of verses because it talks about things that are God's planning ahead of time and the things that he's doing now. So in the now, we have the micro-stories. These are the little tasks he gives us to do. This is the now, what we're doing on the here and now basis. The choices that we make now affect our eternal state. What we're doing now is deciding how we're going to be rewarded at the end and how what our impact is going to be on God's big story. So, story gates, concept of story gates. We talked a little bit about this, just want to go into more. Another way to think of them is checkpoints. They're checkpoints in the story by which a certain set of criteria must be fulfilled. So some examples of that, the seed of woman would crush the serpent's head. Samson, the Philistines would be subdued by him. There's certain things that God had said. These are both prophecies that were very clear. Sometimes they're not so clear prophecies, but it's clear that God's getting to a point and he's going to get there some way. So they create a framework in the macro story. They allow for freedom within the segments, but they constrain that certain things must happen at certain points in time for the story to go on. Now, they're still, like we said, are very vague. They are dramatic climaxes within the story. So they build upon one another towards the end. So even if the player is running around doing various things inside here, like we saw in the diagram before, those story gates are going to add up to a bigger picture. You look about the way that God has dealt with mankind. He started initially by before the flood. Well, he started with Adam, and he gave him, a perfect world, and Adam messed it up. And then God gave mankind longevity and lots of mental capacity, and they messed it up. And then he gave them a law, and they messed it up. And now we're in this place where, we've got the Holy Spirit with us, and yet man is still going downhill. And then you got the millennial kingdom, where God's reigning on earth, and Christ is ruling with a rod of iron, and yet they still mess it up. The big picture is, apart from his indwelling and apart from his will, we can't make it. So you got all these story gates. That's a big picture story gate system, but you got all these pictures, points of convergence that add up to tell a story that God's trying to tell. Micro-stories. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus unto good works, which God hath before ordained that we should walk in them. So the micro-stories, at least in this picture, are the good works. God plans out the good works that are going to come into our life, our opportunities to choose to serve him or not. But he puts those in front of us. He plans those out ahead of time. So micro-stories are the points where we learn to make the choices and get the chance to make the choices which apply the rules of the system or to fail at that. And the manner in which we complete the micro-stories may influence how and if we make it successfully through the next story gate. Do we meet the qualifications of the next story gate? Now, one thing it sounds like here is like we have to get all this stuff in place to make it through the story gate. God's going to make it through the story gate one way or the other. It's a matter of whether we fit the criteria and whether we get any honor or glory out of it. So stirring up some strife, makes a wager with the men of the town, and gets in trouble with them and wipes out the city of Ashkelon. Pretty cool stuff. Computer game stuff, I don't know. You can't make it interactive, but man, movie or something, crazy stuff. It'd be pretty cool. Anyway, then he starts getting in some trouble. He gets mad about going, but he tries to go back to the woman, and then he finds out that she's gotten given away to somebody else, and he gets mad and sets the Philistines' fields on fire, and then he kills 1,000 Philistines with a jawbone of an axe. Another cool sequence. See that. Anyway, but then things start going downhill, and he goes out to Gaza and visits a harlot and ends up carrying the gates away. He moves in with Delilah, and things just start going downhill. And finally, he ends up revealing his secret to Delilah, as all you guys know, gets his eyes poked out, his hair cut off, and is left pretty miserable. God drags him down to the gutter. But God still fulfills his prophecy. He still gets the story through. So Samson turns into a tragic hero. In the end, he pulls down the building on himself. He makes it to the story gate, but he doesn't make it through. Now, Samson had a lot of prophetic stuff around him. He could have been the next king of Israel. He could have been the first king of Israel. There's a lot of things. He was a Nazarite. There's a lot of connections there between him and Christ. There's a picture that could have gone on further, it seems like. But his choices, especially these down here, ruined his possibility of getting through there. So the story ends with God's intention happening, but it ends with him pulling the building down himself. It's kind of a game over situation. But the story got finished. Okay, more examples. There's not always one answer, right? There's different ways, or this is my proposal, is that there's different ways to get through the gate and different ways that things could have worked out. So here's a positive example. David knows he's going to become king of Israel. God lays out chances for him to wipe out Saul. Good spots. There's Saul going to the bathroom in the back of a cave and David sitting there next to him with a sword. Could have finished him off right there. Nobody would have known the difference, and Israel probably would have accepted him. But David, over and over, made the choices to respect God's will and not to take action into his own hands. And that's, I think, a very key point there. God's got his storyline, and David respected that. And because David respected that, God gave David a lot of freedom, and God really, you look at, David messed up at times, but God really put a lot of respect on him as you move through Scripture. So he became the greatest king of Israel. He didn't take Saul. He could have, and he would have fulfilled the prophecy. The prophecy was going to stand. He was going to become king. There was no choice there. But he chose to do it a different way. He chose to let God do it in God's time. Deborah and Barak, this is another one of those ones that's fun to read. Deborah, I don't know how many remember that, but Deborah tells Barak he needs to go out against Sisera. And if he goes out against Sisera, he'll defeat him. And Barak says, I'll go, but only if you go with me. And she says, okay, I'll go with you. So there's Barak's choice. He's got a micro-story in which he's got a choice to go out against Sisera or to get Deborah to go with him. And he chooses to take Deborah with him. The result is, instead of him getting the glory, Sisera is still going to fall. But he's not going to get the glory for doing it. Somebody else is going to. So God's requirements about Sisera falling still had to be met. The Assyrian or Syrian general, I can't remember. Anyway, he had to be killed. But it depended on how it happened on the choices that Barak made. So he had those choices in there. Okay, sometimes there's alternate solutions as well. So these are examples where you might not get through the story gate, but God's still going to solve it. So God and Moses. God's taken the children of Israel out of the land, out of the Egypt, and out into the wilderness, and he's going to make a nation out of them. That much is set in stone. Who he makes them out of suddenly changed. When God said, now therefore let me alone, and in my wrath will wax hot against them, and I may consume them, that is Israel, and make of Moses a great nation. God could have, and if Moses let him do it, God could have wiped them all out and gone on with a different story there. All those guys that had made those choices to murmur against God would have gotten wiped out. They wouldn't have made it through the gate. The gate was still there. They were going to become a nation out there in the wilderness. But it could have been just Moses. And, interestingly enough, Moses makes an appeal on them, and God repents. So Moses, on the other hand, also changed the way that it happened. He switched it back, and the nation of Israel moved on based on his appeal to God. Again, Mordecai and Esther, this is one of the more clear ones. Esther's afraid of going into King Artaxerxes, and trying to appeal for the children of Israel. And Mordecai tells her, "For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place." And then he goes on to say, her house will be wiped out. She'll be destroyed. The gate's still going to happen. God's still going to deliver Israel. There's no doubt about that. But how it happens is going to depend on her choice. And one more concept here, delayed fulfillment. So God said he was going to wipe out Syria, and then Joash only beat on the floor 3 times with the arrows. God said, you're only going to strike them 3 times. Somebody else gets to wipe out Syria. So he didn't get to fully wipe them out because he didn't strike enough times, the number of times that he chose to. So Syria was still going to get destroyed, but it was going to be delayed. It wasn't going to be him doing it. And then one of the more common places where we see delayed fulfillment, and there's lots and lots of these, are dealing with Christ. There's lots of things that were lined up that looked like the first coming of Christ could have been the last coming of Christ. Those things were all in place for it to happen, but it got delayed. For instance, for all the law and prophets prophesied in John, and if you will receive it, this is Elias, which was to come. But they didn't receive him. And so we see that in the end times, looks like he comes back again. And then as was discussed earlier, David delayed his coming to the point of kinghood by continuing waiting to kill Saul. He could have jumped in it early, but it would have been a different David that had done it. So, summarize God's solution to the annoying player problem. He puts dramatic development in a progression from storygate to storygate. The storygate requirements are vague enough that he can fulfill them multiple ways. So the drama of fulfilling them is also in there, but he can do it with different players at different times. And then specifically, he can do it with somebody else. He can delay it. He can wait and do it again later. So he can get everything lined up and then say, okay, we're not going to do it now. We'll do it later. And he can also force the hand of wayward players, like Samson's case. He just beat him down until there was nothing left, and then he fulfilled it. Microstories usually relate to the current storygate requirements. So what we're saying here is that the little things that we choose to do now generally relate to the fulfillment of that storygate that we've got coming up. There's meaning behind it. Now, I don't mean that there's a direct impact, but rather that there's usually something that represents the same character. So the people that were under the law and had certain fulfillments of the law to fulfill, and the law itself had fulfillments that it needed to match. There's pictures that connect between them that give meaning. And kind of a general summary would be that God determines the what, we solve the how in the microstories. So God says, this is what you got to do, this is the little piece that needs to happen, and then we decide how it happens. Exceptions. I said God determines the what, not the how, but when he's dealing with things that are very specific pictures of something he's trying to communicate. You guys want lights on back there or anything? I guess it's in the dark. People nodding off. Alrighty. When he's dealing with something that he wants to portray a very specific picture, then he gets very specific. Aaron's 2 sons that offered the incorrect incense and got burned up in front of everybody. Very specific sacrifice and temple duties. He had some very specific pictures he wanted to portray. He wanted them done very specifically. Some of the battles that he specified, he said, here's how you're going to take Jericho. This is the way to do it. There's a couple of the battles that he said, this is exactly how to do it, and they had to do it that way. And then there's some of the battles where Joshua, it looks like, or whoever was the commander at the time, came up with their own attack. And they came up with their own strategy. Sometimes God said, this is how it has to be done. Sometimes God said, go do it however you do it. Just get it done. So it depends. I think the important thing is that usually when it's got a picture, that's when it gets specific. Yes?
Another thing I was thinking of, in a lot of the battles, it seemed more that God had judged the people, and he was taking care of it, and he was allowing Israel to help out and participate. But like they say, in the battle where they were fighting, there were more people killed by the rocks falling from the sky than there were by the sword. So you start seductively hitting people with rocks.
Yeah, so there's the actual, the slaying of the enemy as well. I was thinking of the strategies that happened, but both of those are true. So in this case, talking about strategizing versus God saying, here's how you're going to take it. But yeah, God's hand was clearly in all of them. Well, all the ones that work, not AI. And this is another interesting point. As God grows in a relationship with people, he gives them more freedom. Remember us talking about David? God gave David the choice over and over to take Saul. David didn't. David let God do it in his time, in his way. God gained a relationship with David through that and through other things that David had done. And as God gained that relationship, he gave him more and more freedom. There's the point where David went out and numbered the people of Israel, and God came against him. He gave David 3 choices of how that destruction was going to come. That's pretty unprecedented. In fact, it's entirely unprecedented that God would give somebody the choice of how their own doom would come and let them play it out. And you find out, I'm giving, unfortunately, both examples like if you're negative, but there's positive ones as well. God seems to give more leeway to those who he trusts will fulfill his will. And there's a fascinating fact of that too. The temple's position was decided by this choice right here. Where the angel was stopped became the position for the temple. If David had chosen something other than a plague, if he had chosen to be attacked by the nations around him, how would the temple been decided? I don't know. It's interesting. Again, Moses striking the rock. This works with both of these. That's why I put it here. But there was a very specific example that God was trying to do when he gave Moses the freedom. Now, he gave Moses had the ability to strike the rock. That's pretty crazy because here's something that's a very, very specific picture God wanted to do. First time he struck the rock, Christ had to be struck and the water came out. Second time, all he had to do was speak to it. Now all we have to do is call upon Christ and the water flows. And yet, Moses struck the rock the second time and God got over him at it. But he was given that freedom. He was given the choice. And there's a lot of places you look at, Elijah with the calling the bears out? No. Elisha calling the bears out. Yeah. And God goes through it. You're like, God's not going to do that. No, God does it. God gives a lot of freedom to the people that follow his will. And, of course, we can't talk about following the rules unless we talk about Christ. Here is a cool verse because it gives a list. That's 1 Timothy, I think, right? I've only used 2 letters. That could be Titus or Timothy. A bunch of story gates. This is kind of a good way to see some prophecies that Christ had fulfilled and did. Without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. God was manifest in the flesh, justified in the spirit, seen of angels, preached unto the Gentiles, believed on in the world, and received up into glory. Christ had many, many story gates. There is a ton of stuff that Christ had to fulfill. Christ had to meet to the letter, and he did. And some things he didn't have to meet to the letter. He had to meet to the generality. And some things he just had a sense of humor on meeting, like the whole Nazarite thing, which is a lot of fun. So, but he met them all. He didn't meet them necessarily how people expected him to, but he met them. And that was really interesting to me. There's a picture of somebody going through several story gates. You could do the same thing with David's life. He made it through several of the story gates. The story in his life progresses based on the choices that he makes. So, applying some of this. God's the master storyteller. The things we talked about at the beginning are still problems. We're still got lots and lots of complexity to try and make real interactive stories. But there's still things that we can be doing. So some concepts that I see and some things that I've been applying in terms of adding drama to games, for instance, that we're taking a step back now, back to that beginning concept of interactive storytelling and saying there's lots of really hard stuff to do with trying to mimic human interaction, but what are some of the ideas that are there, like for us as game developers, moving up into the drama realm, how can we add more drama to the story? So this is kind of the point from before. Are we trying to fit the story to the game or the game to the story? Have we figured out the cool interactivity part, the challenge, the goal, and now we're trying to make a storyline around it? Or do we have a drama that we think is really worth telling and we're making it somewhat interactive? Or coming up with multiple ways to make it interactive? And when you're building that, then let's say you've got a game with a story in it, do you look for ways to interactively add drama to the story? And these are some examples of doing that. Look at what the player cares about and make it central. For instance, you got a real-time strategy game, and you got one of your little troops that's out there, and the player is trying to save those troops, and there's no way statistically that troop is ever going to survive. The games, if you're running a game and it's all about interactivity, statistics say that troop's going to die, it's dead, you go on, you leave it. If you're paying attention to the drama, though, won't a heroic escape look a lot better? If you've got a game engine, you're thinking about how can I add drama to the story, it takes a different shape. You have different choices. You're not just doing the statistic play out. You're saying, where's the player's heart? And how can I make this interesting to them? And there's lots of ways to do that. You can also modify the environment to add drama. To add drama, remember again, not to foil the player, but to make it more interesting. Is the player about to make it to something really good or get to the end? Or does one of the examples that Chris Crawford gives I thought was interesting is that mountaintop battle and the good guy's just about to defeat the bad guy. So you're playing it, yeah, you got him, and then the rocks gives away below your feet and you slip down or something. And now you've made the game more interesting. But it felt interactive because it wasn't like, it happened in a cutscene, it happened in the game. The game reacted to the fact that you were about to defeat the bad guy, or the game reacted in some way to something that you were going to make it to that seemed obvious, and then switches it. And you can do that interactively. Scary games. Scary games are a great place. Fear is one thing that's really easy to do interactively. Fear is for some reason, a fairly easy to define emotion, at least for my sitting down trying to do mathematically. Fear is easy. Excitement is fairly easy. Tension, those kind of things. You start getting into things like happiness, a lot harder to define. Comedy is nearly impossible unless you get lucky, but then that's comedy. So anyway, operators of attention. You generate the bad guys where they're scary, not where the computer says, okay, this room's going to generate X number of bad guys at X amount of time. You figure out, generate them when they're not looking, if that's the kind of bad guy you want. Generate them when they are looking, if that's the kind of bad guy you want. Do you put them in the closet when they're not expecting it? Do you put them in some hidden place? How do you figure out where the player is expecting things and figure out what's scary to the player and then generate it so it's scary? Generate it so they don't expect it. And then obvious piece of drama that some people overlook, are you paying attention to the music? You got great music, but it plays the whole game. Does it change when the mood changes? Do you actually progress? Do you get scary when it's scary? Does it get exciting when it's happy? And so on. You do pay attention. Do you have dramatic sad moments? Do you play sad music? Do you pay attention to that? It's a really subtle thing that massively, massively impacts a person's acceptance and understanding of the game. It's one of those subtle things. The concept of adding interactive storytelling to the games is talking about a little bit more about changing the way that you can impact the story. So the choices your players are called to make relate to the big pictures. They're a bigger part to the story that you're giving them, and you're allowing them to make choices in there that are going to result in something different at the end. Not necessarily something that's going to win the game or not win the game, but rather something that changes the way the story develops. Who's the hero? Who's not? Who changes sides? Who stays with you? And are you giving your players alternate ways to solve the problems? This is one of the ones that's really interesting. If you're keeping track of the score, Chris Crawford, his ultimate solution, which is probably the reason I decided to do a lot of this, his ultimate solution to the interactive storytelling problem was just to keep a score. So you let them do whatever you want, but the score tells them whether they're doing the right thing or not. Like, well, that's just a game, because then the goal of the game is to make a high score. If you're writing something that's a story, the goal of the game is not just about the high score, it's about the progress of the story itself. And so, giving alternate solutions, if you have alternate solutions, but one's still a higher score, it's the best option, that's not really interesting. If you've got alternate solutions that deal with the person's character, the type of person they are, that's more interesting. To give a solution that the person who's the puzzle solver would figure out, a different one that the brute force person's going to solve, a different one that the tactile person's going to solve. And then also, when you look at the choices, is the right answer something that they're not going to pay attention to? Remember the Pharisees' questions. Generally, when you're dealing with the hard questions of life, the right answer isn't the two options the world gives you. The world says, do you render unto Caesar or do you not? Do you this or do you do this or not? They give you the two options. Usually, if the world's giving you two options, Republican or Democrat, they're both wrong if the world's giving them to you. Or they both have a little bit that's right. But generally, if the world's giving you options, you got to look somewhere else. And that's, I think, an important thing to look at here. Do you shoot the bad guy or do you do something else with him? Well, generally, the right answer is, do you love him? Do you give the option to beat people by loving them versus by defeating them? Or is there something else to think about there? And do the consequences of how they solve those problems, good or bad, follow them through the game? So solving a problem wrong, if we mess up on one micro story, God doesn't wipe us out. That's not the end. Now, the impact of that story, the fruit of that story may continue through, but it's not necessarily going to stop us at that point. But it may have impact later on in life. Sorry, you're asking something?
I just wanted to say that, the choice of not killing someone or something like that has been something I've been waiting for in games a long time. It's like I don't want to shoot this guy. It's like, oh my God.
Yeah.
That's how he's played the game. I don't want to play it like that.
Yeah, I saw when they first were talking about Splinter Cell, it was like, oh, cool, Splinter Cell is going to be a game where you don't have to kill everybody. And then I watch the demo, and it's like every person that comes in contact with he kills, he just kills them really quietly. Right. No, okay, yeah, right. It's not about the choice of killing him or not, it's just, do you kill him quietly? Does he scream a lot, or does he just fall over dead? Anyway. Okay. Again, meaningful choices on story progression, not just, and by meaningful, once again, drama consequences, dealing with character development, not just story progression. And can you force or delay a solution instead of killing off the player? Once again, that concept of the microstory. If you fail in the microstory, don't end the game. Can you just go on, but make it a little bit different because you failed? Or you give them the option again. You delay the solution, or you force their hand. It looks like they're going to fail. You get them through that one, and then next time they play it, they'll know how to do it right. Because one of the other things that's not here, but obviously, dying and restarting lots kind of ruins the story. You want a story to go, not just loop. So if you mess up, it changes the story. It doesn't have a game. And adding meaning to the games. This is probably a lot of things that we're thinking about too. How do you put Christian principles in a game? This is why I think interactive storytelling is really interesting for us, because if you've got a game that's got lots of action and a Christian veneer, you're not presenting moral issues. You're not presenting real life applications. You're just dealing with some memory verses or whatever else is in there that makes the puzzle game work or the adventure game work. But to actually convey the heart of God, there's got to be a heart in the game. And to have a heart in the game, there's got to be a story in the game. So stories are very, very essential to presenting moral and social issues to the people that play them. So are your players able to take actions? So I'm asking, this is kind of a reverse question, but do you not follow through on the consequences? If somebody shoots somebody else, is there moral consequences to that? Later on in the game, does that come back to haunt them? Does that become an issue? If they do something that's, most games, there's like no concept of the impact of the things you do. You just do the things because you're solving the puzzle. We say if you make it real life, the things that you have to do and the choices that you make to solve the puzzles actually have an impact on your character development and the development of the characters that are in the story. It's a way to not have to interact really carefully with people, but at least see the impact of those choices. And does the story of your game, as well as the main arc, I meant to say the micro stories in your game, as well as the main story, have real meaning. So is everything that you're doing, the things that you're accomplishing, is the meaning to them in the story, and it doesn't have, and by real meaning, does it represent Christ? Does it represent God's love? Does it represent something that has real meaning about how people operate and how we should operate with them? And then do the rules of your game relate to those meaning? And by rules, I mean the systems, the controls you have, how you get through that. It's kind of vague, but if you want to show, like we talked about, the difference between shooting somebody or loving them, you'd have to have both options there. You'd have to allow the rules to let you do the things that you need to be able to do, and on the other hand, hinder the things that you don't want to really talk about in the story. If there's parts of the story development, the picture you're trying to paint, that don't have meaning in the game, cut those off and figure out just what you can present to actually show the meaning. And, of course, are character traits other than quick thinking and fast clicking required for your game? Is it just a goal of trying to shoot as many things and run around as quick as possible and figure out some couple puzzles? Or is there something that actually questions heart issues? Are you dealing, like we talked about, are you loving your enemies? Are you coming up with alternate solutions that actually have meaning? Are you concerned about character development because that's actually going to, or develop a relationship with a character because that's actually going to drive the story? What kind of things can you do that would cause people's moral character to have to be called into question to actually complete the game? And, of course, when they fail, do you just beat them down, or do you give them a chance to try again and keep going? So, going back to that same concept, do they die, or do you figure out a way to go on and actually teach them? And that kind of gives you one of the other big things. How does God treat us? We're players in His interactive story. He gives us a lot of options. He gives us a lot of leeway. And He loves us. He's interested in leading us through the story because He has a picture that He wants to paint in our own lives. We can't perfectly copy what He's doing, but we can seek to follow His patterns. We can seek to try and give that same kind of love that He gives us to the player and actually give them meaning out of what they're playing, as opposed to just running through and shooting things. And that's my conclusion. Any questions? Sounds
8:45.
we're good. sleep?
No.
Yeah.
That was excellent.
Okay. Well, it's kind of interesting because in my game I'm working with here, although you do defeat the arch guy, you actually save his henchman.
Yeah. Do they get saved through recognizing the value that you've done to them, or the?
Yeah, actually, in my case, what happens is he's a gang leader. And when first of all you fight him, you have two physical weapons you use. And you defeat him physically. And then later on, he's lost face with his gang. So he feels he has to come at you again. But the second time you come at him, you have spiritual armor. And then use the word of God against him, and you turn him around to where he realizes what's going on. And later on, he goes back, and later on, in one place where you really need a power boost, is because he listened to you, became saved, and in the dark spot where you need it, suddenly the power is there from his salvation.
Yeah. You know, that's what's really interesting is when you look at a lot of modern media, I mean, how many times has the bad guy turned into the hero? You've got, some really cool bad guy, and after enough time, whoever it is, Dr. Doom, Darth Vader, Venom, whoever the bad guy is, sooner or later starts becoming the good guy. You give enough time, yeah. And that's the interesting thing. I mean, people love the story, the concept of the salvation of the bad guy. Seeing somebody turn around. I mean, seeing somebody change their life, character development, is probably the most thrilling thing when you really get down to it that you can experience in life. And find that in computer games. How many computer games do you get to the end and you get to do something good for the bad guy and see them change?
So when you talk about it's basically.
In Star Wars, they did kill the Emperor, but they saved Darth Vader.
Right. Well, he died, but
Yeah, but you see the character development. You see him change. I mean, that's what made the movie really.
Right.
In the end, was that there's this great character development behind it.
So basically,
Great
taking
idea.
a game like Grand Theft Auto becoming a Christian game by saving the game leaders instead of joining them. I mean, that's basically the same thing.
I don't know about that, but
Well, I mean, if you take a look at that, I mean, you could change it that way. Well, you've got an urban environment that's completely interactive. People do live that way in some areas. It has been dramatized up a lot, but you tone that portion of it down. Hot coffee doesn't have to be part of it.
you can make your own mod for it.
That's
This would be
right.
kind of cool.
You
Make a
could.
Christian mod.
But I mean, you could go in.
That gets you pressed.
You could go in as in trying to start up a home church. The goal is to go out and save them.
Yeah.
You could end up dead. Through your choices that you make and their reactions to them. Or you could end up as a martyr in that aspect, or you could end up being a pastor of a church. I mean, you could take that game and modify it in such a way as you were talking about.
That is a
And
point I
someone else
mentioned.
could pick up, and someone else could
Pick up the
your
story. This story could be a never-ending story because of the converts that he has, picking up after you left off. Again, Paul, Silas, Stephen. You could take that into a modern era, and you could use Grand Theft Auto as that.
Yeah. That's one of the things I've been thinking about, but I didn't bother bringing up the presentation. But I mean, the concept of the death of the character, normally in a game, it's a comparison, but in a game, the goal is to live.
Right.
But in a story, oftentimes, it's far better thing to die.
Well, you
have-
end the story by shutting
But you
the
don't
book.
have to end the story, is the thing. The story would go on after you die, and you can present that, that the character makes it to a certain point, they die in self-sacrifice, and the story progresses. It
Which
still has
opens
meaning.
up a separate time gate, story gate, where you can go off in a different tangent. So you can still have that branching, coming to a different conclusion, but in a different tunnel somewhere else, in regards to that circle you drew. The ending point can still be the same, at least the subject part of it.
Right.
I think one of the limitations on what we do in interactive or game storytelling is that the action in games is almost always physical.
Right.
And you miss that, a lot of your choices in the real world are based upon the verbal communication. And that's really hard to weave into gameplay.
Well, the cutscenes
Or,
can
because some of the things of your decision making, you gotta be able to ask the question or pose the question either, from some disembodied third party or from one of the players that then elicits you to make a decision that results in physical action. without that verbal, you know, makes it a lot more difficult. you know?
Yeah, I'm not saying it's easy solutions, it is very difficult to do, it certainly is, but it's something good to keep in mind at least.
Well, no, but you're right, cutscenes would add to that to a degree, as you were
I do
saying.
that, I use, in my game,
But there's still a lot of people who wanna play a game, not play a movie though.
Right, but cutscenes can
Halo
add,
is a perfect
but
example of
cutscenes
that.
can show the heart of the character and why he feels a certain way. And then then the action goes on, and you now know more about the guy's heart that you didn't before.
Yeah, it's just, that's the concept of interactive storytelling, is if you cut scene and show the character's heart, which is, you know, part of the arguments about this, is that, you know, you show their heart and it's not the player's heart, then you've presented a story that's something other than collaboration with the player.
True, but even with
So you have
God-
to recognize what's the player really trying to develop here.
This story
So
So the
it's
has,
player could still choose to go against what you've shown, just like.
you give them that choice, that option.
Right, but then the cutscene wouldn't
Like
play
solving-
showing them having a good heart if they've just gone around shooting people.
No, you'd have to have
No, I
multiple
mean,
cutscenes
you
that
can-
go to that.
Right.
You can show a heart that they're pulled one way. Doesn't necessarily mean they go that way all the time.
How, we don't have an engine that's strong enough there, do we? We're talking about a
Yes, and-
theoretical 20 possible cutscenes for every one action to show.
Right, what
character
you do is you
motion.
don't, you create a
Well-
world, and you create an environment where these things happen dynamically, and then you have to build all the rules about how a world really works, so that it automatically decides what the story has to be, and then it builds all that.
But
And that's that big list of,
Right,
yes,
but the
you
thing
have
is
to
though,
do this
is
thing.
how many people, when they play a
Scenario
game,
coding,
wanna spend
right?
that much time playing a game?
Exactly.
About the cutscenes, I found a lot of times they can be kind of frustrating in that often the cutscene will make the character do something that I didn't want the character
Right.
to do.
Right, exactly.
Or they'll do something really stupid.
Yeah. Chef, right?
That's what we did.
Clear.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Solve.
So, okay, so there's several different piles of the dilemma here. There's a technical issue, there's a design issue, there's a what do you really want to do in the first place kind of issue.
Game engine issue.
There's the theoretical model of interactive storytelling itself. Somebody mentioned pen and paper, and one of your premises was
Oh, yeah.
nobody has done it well. What is the key things that the pen and paper, being able to set aside, say, the technical side and some of these other dilemmas,
Right.
what have they completely botched on?
No, actually, the interactive side of role playing is actually very close to interactive storytelling. I think it is, because it's a person telling you a story and you're getting to interact with it. So role playing on the pen and paper side is very close. You could argue some things about the rules, and you could argue that most role playing games aren't dealing with character development as much as they are with still achieving a goal. So they're acting more like a game than like a storytelling thing. But I think it's something that if you had a good DM, you could actually get to a point where you were dealing with character development. If you had a DM that actually thought in terms of storytelling and was able to pull it off, it's something that a human could do.
Right, but how many people wanna be that good at the end? That's the
You need to
problem.
get paid
You're not
pretty good to
gonna
do
give-
that.
I mean, a lot of 9, 10, 12, 14, 15, they don't wanna be that good DM.
No, I'm not saying that this is a solution, but
Right, yeah.
it's correct. That is
You are right,
what the
it
right
is.
idea
Have you
is.
ever done simming
Then what?
on the net?
Sim?
Simming, it's not playing Sims,
Oh,
but simming basically is that they did it on Star Trek, where you pretty much knew the world, and you could pull anything you knew from the world into the game environment. You're playing a particular post, and you use any of your knowledge
Kind of like
from
scenario
that
building.
to change the storyline around.
So it's
And
still
to
kind of like
solve-
role playing, though,
Right,
it's
it just
done with
keeps-
real people as opposed to
Yeah,
a
and you
computer.
type it in.
Okay.
But you are locked within a role, say, okay, you're this person, you're within this environment, you can't suddenly sprout wings and fly out the door or something like that.
right.
It has.
But you have choices and
constraints.
freedom within a real world.
Right. So the question, a lot of these things are really good. I mean, they're very pure forms of interactivity. The question is always still, are they developing a story? Does it have meaning?
Question, that's still fun.
Well, that's the thing, the fun
Well,
factor's
that's
gotta be
also a
there. If
question.
it's so complex, it's not fun, who's gonna buy it and why?
Yeah, one of the things that comes to mind is the potential to have kind of a backstory or a back portion of the game for a specific character. And depending on how the character progresses through the backstory determines how they will react then in the major portion of the game. You know, because we were talking about the dynamics of if a character, you know, this character has 400 different 400 different attributes that they might possess. And you got another character, now you got 400 by 400 matrix of possible interactions. But if you did something like a backstory that developed the attributes of a character, they could be different, but then it becomes essentially a table load.
So the computer tries to discern based on the choices that
They made in the backstory as to how they'll react in the main story.
Similar to the concept of role-playing, where you decide
Yeah.
which characteristics about your character.
Yeah.
Ultimate 4, because they had a similar set like that.
That, no, I didn't. And how did that work out?
I didn't like it because it ended up being essentially how you picked your class. And they didn't tell you the rule, they just basically said, here's the choices, and there's moral, but actually they were laid out literally moral choices, and you gotta figure out what's best. And then they ended up just saying, throwing you out into this imaginary world, saying, okay, congratulations, you're now a shepherd. Which was actually the best possible class if you did the math. But, you know, you could have been a mage, you could have been all sorts of things.
That's terming vocation, but I mean, you also in role-playing have what, like chaotic neutral, where you have all these, terms that
Right.
define your moral stance as well. Sorry, one of the things, we were jumping a couple topics here, but one of the things we're talking about with the interactive storytelling, I'm arguing on the side of, what's our interactive storytelling or not, but that doesn't mean, to me, I maybe should have summarized that, I kind of did, but interactive storytelling is probably nothing that any of us in here are ever going to really get to do. Because not only is it incredibly hard and maybe impossible to really do right, but it's, like you said, a whole lot of complexity, a whole lot of stuff that we probably don't really need to put in a game. And in the end, there'll be a big question if it's fun or not. So the question is then, what can we pull out of it? Because interactive storytelling is real life. What can we pull out of real life and the concepts that are going into interactive storytelling in, small enough bite-sized chunks that we can stick in there and throw a little piece of meaning in there, or a level of it. We can't let them interact with everything, but can we narrow it down to a certain level of interactivity that still has meaning and try and throw that in? And those are the things we're looking
That
at.
would depend completely on the game and the age group you're going after. If I'm doing an age group to 6 years old, I'll make everything interactive so they can wander around this playfield. They touch a rock, the rock springs to life and says a funny little tune.
Like humongous games.
That would be, well, yeah. That's fine. And Jeff Dawson's working on that right now as well too. I mean, that would be interactive for that age group. But if I want to blow things
But
up.
storytelling is the...
Yeah, well, Halo's got that too. You've seen those places where they've got the physical kinetics of blowing up the warthog. They can do
Once
flips
again,
and lips.
interactivity is very prevalent in games.
Right.
Interactivity isn't, if you're a game developer, interactivity isn't your problem.
Right.
Storytelling is your problem.
Yes. But
If you're a...
there's not a great story in that part because they tell you the whole thing at the end. You have no real influence in there. It all depends on who you're going after. And the problem is by the time we actually figure this out, who's going to want to buy it? There might be something brand new type of gaming out there that they want to go after that we now have to play catch up to again.
Well, maybe. People say this is it, so...
Yeah, I know.
I've been in a number of discussions when you start talking about first-person games, and especially talking about developing Christian games, the thing that everybody comes to is that what could separate a great first-person Christian game from the typical first-person shooter game is moral choices, right? That there are consequences for actions. There are consequences, both physical, the affecting of skills. I mean, if your character has a heart and chooses to shoot the unarmed bystander instead of passing that up, he's less likely to shoot the next time, or he's less likely to be able to hold the gun still, or less likely to, something's
Right.
happening.
But you still have to have a goal.
Or shoot the bad guys.
Or shoot,
Right.
right.
Even shooting the bad guy is the question.
Right.
Do you wound the bad guy instead of shoot him?
Well,
Just-
no,
yeah, just
or
make it-
or the other thing
Or is it a Tom
is the
Clancy
choice
novel?
to not do something, and the bad guy just kills you.
Well, and then you play the martyr, yes.
Right.
Sorry.
Well, I think that's one of the things with games is so many times it's such a cold world. There's a moral choice never gives goodie, but making a bad choice, like, no, that's not what I want to do, but that's the rewarding or something like that.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
If you're rewarded for bad choices,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the interesting point.
give the guy a headshot and it advances you further.
The question becomes, is it fun too? Because, if you're giving people social consequences for actions that they want to take, that they don't want to have to experience. I mean, that's part of the goal of playing games, is right, escapism.
Right.
And both movies and games. So, hang on just a second, I was gonna say, so the thing is that the solution isn't to put down moral consequences in a way, I mean, that may be a byproduct of it, of that are bad, but look where are the moral consequences that could be good, where are the options that you can do good things that are good, that are gonna excite the player.
Okay.
Sorry, Jim.
One other thing that's quickly just jumping out at me is the apparent complexity and complexity aren't necessarily the same thing. In that, you know, the mechanism to breathing has maybe 100 different variables at the chemical, biological, atomic, there's all sorts of things that could go wrong, but usually don't. And so then we say, oh, it's simple, you just breathe, you don't think about it, you can do it in your sleep, you just can't do it underwater. You know, there's some basic, simple
Yeah.
rules
Yes.
that become normal. And that might be one of the things to think about is even if we,
Mhm.
if we're wrestling with this going, oh my goodness, there's too many variables, well, maybe you say, okay, which layer of the problem do I want to deal with? And if I can come up with a solution that's 99% of the true, players will essentially just, that will become autopilot to them and they'll
Fill in the
expect it.
gaps and they'll go with it.
Well, that's a good point.
I mean, the story of Brother Andrew would be perfect for something like that. If you know that, do you know that story? Of smuggling the Bibles into communists and making those moral choices. Do I not say something? Do I lie about this? Do I get the Bibles to this person? Do I talk to this other person? I mean, Bible smuggling. You have the escapism. You can't shoot the KGB guards because that would kill you right then and there. You can't smuggle Bibles anymore. And you'd still have the moral choices to make. And in one of, if I remember reading it right correctly, he conversed with another person by reading the Bible scriptures to that other
That was really
person
cool,
and
yeah.
picking them out, and you could communicate. You have the whole Bible right there. You could then have another conversation, and that would be your randomness, and not
Yes.
to pick different choices.
So, know that, so he couldn't speak the language.
Right.
So he met up with this guy and he couldn't speak the language, and two of them are standing there realizing they can't talk. But then he realizes he can use verses. So they both flip open their Bibles and they figure out how to translate some of the chapters.
And the first one is
and they're-
Titus, and I welcome you, brother.
Yeah, that's, he says that, and the guy, they're going back and forth talking through verses, it was so cool.
And being that he's still alive, I'm sure he'd go for it, but nonetheless, so, I mean, what a wonderful game that gives you that first-person shooter
Mhm.
possibility, gives you all the moral choices, you can learn the Bible and the same thing, because you'd have conversations with people, I mean, and that would give you an ending point, you know, as well too, but you'd still be able to wander all over Eastern Europe and with that bug that went 300,000 miles without a tune-up. That was amazing. Anyway, I'm sorry. That was just the first
No.
thought, as soon as you came in, because
Yeah.
that simplifies the whole process right there. And we're looking at a first-person shooter, we don't have to have a gun.
Right.
The enemy can have guns.
Right.
But we don't.
Right.
I mean, that gives you up into, there's a movie that just got shot up in Washington called Squad 77. And they shot it's a story about kids, PKs and MKs, who aren't really acting like they should, go and rescue a missionary behind Chinese lines. That's the whole concept of it. And you still have that action and adventure, that excitement right there,
Right.
that drama from the choices. I don't know if it'll work or not, but it's a thought.
Yeah, it's a cool idea. And that's a good example when you take something like that where, I mean, a good example of, I hadn't thought about this to mention it, but God using environmental changes for dramatic effect. I mean, God does that a lot of times. You know, the car breaks down at the worst possible place. You think it's the worst possible place. God's doing it for dramatic effect because he knows he's going to get you out at the end, but you don't know.
And there's a cutscene right to a mechanic saying, oh, I'll do this for free and fixing your car for you, right down there.
Well, or you'd have to have patience.
Or
right?
like
Or
right, the
patience,
car
yes.
breaks down in the middle of the desert,
Right.
across from the only payphone within 10 miles.
There you go. And the question is, can you call collect or do you have a quarter? Anytime you know that guy appears. Oh, Carrot Top appears, no.
Yeah,
the
that's
guy's
one of
creative,
those.
though.
That's
The
one of
guy's
those
awesome,
segues
yeah,
like
right.
touching the dancing rock.
That's
you know?
true,
You
yes.
just don't want to go there.
Oh, well.
All right. Well, I think we're done.
Cool.
Well, that was great.
Well,
That really was.